Okay, so some of us made it further along than this, but for now, we will start with the Treaty of Paris, 1898. You do want to remember the year for this treaty since there are so many other treaties of Paris. But this is the treaty that will end the Spanish-American War. The United States and Spain signed this treaty on December 10th of 1898. So since the war had begun that very same year, you know that this wasn't a very long fought war. But it's important to know that the Treaty of Paris did three things. First, Cuba gained independence from Spain. But was under the American government's control until 1902. Secondly, Spain ceded, and that is spelled C-E-D-E-D, ceded. Spain ceded Puerto Rico and Guam, G-U-A-M, to the United States. That means those two territories were given to us. Lastly, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. So we now have acquired the Philippines for $20 million. Moving on to acquiring new lands. The maps on the screen display Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico wanted complete independence. So if you imagine that, it wasn't like they wanted to be under the United States control. They had wanted to be completely independent from the Spain and the United States. But Puerto Rico was geographically important to the United States. In order to maintain influence in the Caribbean and also for the future building of the Panama Canal. Now, you don't have to write this down, but we do, as you know, still possess Puerto Rico today. It is a territory. It is a commonwealth. They are given citizenship and certain rights, similar that we have here in the United States, but they aren't able to vote for all the same things we are if they maintain a Puerto Rican residence. That's only for your own benefit to know. We can talk more about Puerto Rico later. We still do possess it today. Moving on to Cuba. The first thing you should see on your outline is the Teller Amendment. Cuba was scared that the United States would try to annex it after the Spanish-American War. So U.S. Senator Teller added an amendment to the U.S. Declaration of War to say that Cuba would be given its independence. So what I'm saying here is that from the beginning, Cuba was worried. Yes, they wanted America to help, but they didn't want America to annex it, and they were afraid of that happening at the end of the Spanish-American War. So when declaring war, Senator Teller added an amendment saying Cuba would be given its independence. But we know that at the end of the war, no political freedom was given to Cuba. No political freedom was given to Cuba after the war. Technically, we didn't annex it, but we still controlled them. The United States would help to improve Cuba, especially in agriculture, education, and health. Moving on to the Platt Amendment. This amendment was added to the Cuban Constitution. And it established three things. The United States had the right to intervene in Cuba if Cuba was unstable. So the first one, the United States had the right to intervene in Cuba if Cuba was unstable. Secondly, Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. Cuba became a protectorate of the United States. And a protectorate is when a country is only partially controlled by a stronger power. So we were partially controlling Cuba. The third aspect of the Platt Amendment stated that Cuba must lease harbors to the United States for naval bases. Cuba must lease harbors to the United States for naval bases. Okay, moving on to the Philippines. Filipinos rebel. The Filipinos felt betrayed when the United States annexed the Philippines. They had wanted their complete independence, so they were upset when the United States annexed them at the end of the war. But the U.S. saw the Philippines as a gateway to China. In 1899, the Philippine-American War began. There was essentially an uprising within the Philippines, so the Filipinos were leading a revolt against the American government in the Philippines. The United States engaged in similar measures compared to what the Spanish had done in Cuba. So the United States mimicked Cuba. They put the Filipinos in detention camps to prevent them from joining the rebellion. Many died of disease and starvation. Remember, we accused the Spanish of doing this to the Cubans, but now we're turning around and doing a very similar thing. During American occupation, Americans looked at the Filipinos as inferiors. It took the United States about 3 years to put down the rebellion, and it cost $400 million and 4,000 lives. So this rebellion costs more than we actually paid for it. The aftermath of this war, the United States set up a government similar to what they did in Puerto Rico, keeping the Philippines as an American territory but giving it certain rights. The Philippines would eventually become an independent country in 1946. The last thing we'll talk about is China. Foreign influence in China. China was very weak at this time and had already been occupied by European nations. The United States saw potential markets in China and feared that it would be left out of the spheres of influence. You don't have to call them spheres of influence. They feared that it would be left out of the division in China. Basically meaning if different European nations are controlling kind of different regions in China, especially the major Chinese cities, America didn't want to be left out of that. To protect American interests, the United States Secretary of State John Hay issued a series of notes that he referred to as an open door policy. It proposed that European nations would share trading rights with the United States so that China would have an open door to all foreign nations, trying to ensure that no one would get shut out of trading rights. Many Chinese resented foreign invaders, so this is going to lead up to the Boxer Rebellion. So many Chinese resented the foreign invaders in the country and set up a secret organization to overthrow them. They were named the Boxers by the Westerners because their members practiced martial arts. The Boxers destroyed European property and killed hundreds of foreigners. The U.S. sent in troops and navy to safeguard the world's trade in China and to protect their investments. The international forces, including the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, who were all occupying China at the time, they were able to put down the Boxer Rebellion. This would lead to a second series of open door notes by Senator John Hay. His second series of open door notes reflected deeply on three American beliefs. Firstly, it stated that Americans believed that the growth of the U.S. economy depended on exports. That Americans believed that the growth of the U.S. economy depended on exports. Second, they felt the United States had a right to intervene abroad to keep foreign markets open. So the United States would have the right to intervene abroad if U.S. trade was threatened. Thirdly, they feared that the closing of an area to American products, citizens, or ideas threatened U.S. survival. These ideas become, part of Americans' foreign policy, especially talking about American economy. Lastly today, you see a bullet that should say the impact of U.S. territorial gains. So how is the aftermath affected by this? Well, the key thing to understand is that the debate over imperialism just continued. With many disagreeing on whether or not the United States should continue to exert influence over other nations around the world. Most disagreeing on whether or not the United States should continue to exert influence over other nations around the world. Okay, we will stop here and we will finish the notes tomorrow. Please listen to it again if you need to and write down any questions you may have. I'll see you tomorrow.